Well, good afternoon. This is Micah Young, the Micah Young Podcast. Well, thank you so much for listening and watching. We appreciate your support and are just blessed every time we find out someone's been listening. We started on the last podcast talking about shame. And I want to encourage you that to go back and listen to Shame Part 1. There's a lot that we're going to be building off of that today in defining shame and describing shame. And in Genesis 1, 2, and 3, how shame came to be about in our life and the impact that it has. And so I'm going to take off where we left off. But as I said, I want to encourage you to go back and listen to that one, because some of this may not be as clear and as relevant unless you have the framework for the first part of it. We ended up last time talking about shame and how that shame can be this roaring lion. It can be this condemnation. It can be this judgment that just jumps on, that just encompasses our life. And but it doesn't have to be here right now. It can also be in the form of fear. I'm afraid I'm going to be embarrassed. I'm afraid I'm going to be a failure. And how much of our life is limited by things that we are afraid of happening, or afraid of being embarrassed, or afraid of being judged, and how much of life we miss out on. And as I said last time, if you'll just listen to conversations around you and notice how many times the phrase "I was afraid" or "I am afraid" is used in limiting our life or dragging up the past and things that happened to us. And that shame can be intense when it comes as an obvious failure, but more often than not, it's something that is just prevailing. And that was part of the definition. It's a prevailing sense. It's here all the time. Sometimes it's intense, sometimes it's not so intense. But in many of us, it influences our life and influences our decision day in and day out. And so we've been talking about recognizing shame, and we easily recognize shame after we failed or there's been an exposure, and when it's intense, such as, I really should be ashamed of myself for doing that. But it's more difficult to recognize shame as the primary motive behind much of what we do day in and day out. It's hard to see that shame can be the motivation behind our seeming success. Now, we don't call it shame when we feel like we have to succeed. We call that feeling being motivated. We don't call it shame when we have to win. We call that competition. We don't call it shame whenever we have to be right about something. We call that confidence. But it permeates so much of what we do. We have to be right. We have to come up with names and phrases and perspectives for it, not realizing that shame is really the motivation. It's very easy to miss when we think we're successful at maintaining the cover-up. When we think we have an adequate fig leaf, when we think we have an adequate cover, we don't realize that it was shame that motivated us to spend so much time and effort creating that leaf. It's hard to recognize it. It's much more difficult to recognize it when we're the life of the party. It's much more difficult to recognize when everybody likes me that it was shame that motivates me to want to get everybody to like me. It's much more difficult to recognize when I think I've been successful at compensating for my shame, not recognizing that it was shame that drives my attempts at compensation. Why did I need to compensate in the first place? When we're financially stable, whenever we've done a good job, when we've been successful and have been recognized for it, it's hard to understand that shame may very well be the driving force behind those accomplishments. I know many very, very successful people that at the heart of their motivation was shame. Shame of their past, shame of their heritage, shame of their upbringing, shame of their education, shame of their lack. And it drove them. It was the motivation to compensate for that. And I'm never going to be exposed again. I'm never going to be embarrassed again. I'm never going to be disliked or disapproved again. And we applaud that in our culture, not understanding that it may very well be shame that's driving that influence. Now, shame doesn't come along necessarily and use the words. I mean, sometimes it does, but it doesn't say you're worthless. Now, I know sometimes it does. You're unwanted. Yeah, sometimes it does. It does say stuff like that. You know, no one really cares about you. That's how it's phrased. You know, really, no one really likes you very much. No one wants to hear about your trouble. You have really done it now. What makes you think you can pull that off? That's just like you to blow it again. See, it doesn't use the word shame and condemnation and guilt and embarrassment. It just phrases it in a way that summons shame to the forefront, that summons it into our life. After all these promises and all these commitments, you have blown it again. You're never going to get it right. There's that shame again. Because you know, everyone has it together but you. If you just weren't so stupid, so weak, so helpless, whatever. No one understands what you're going through. You're the only human being on earth that's ever felt this way. Your situation is unique. Nobody can relate to what you're feeling and what is happening to your life. You have nothing to offer anybody. You are so broken and so messed up, you have nothing to give to anyone. You cannot let anyone know what is really going on, or they won't want anything to do with you. Well, at least I'm not as bad as so-and-so. Well, I would never do that. Nobody's interested in me. Nothing can help you now. You really should be ashamed. You know, you're just not that important. God cannot use you now. You have crossed the line. You cannot be around anyone or they will know what is going on with you. Well, you're just always going to be this way. Because of this feeling, I feel better about myself. Even that is an expression of shame. Because I did something that made me feel better about me as a person is an indication shame was the motivation. See, we recognize shame in the failures, but we don't recognize it in the successes. When I'm feeling pretty good about myself, based on how I have performed, what I have accomplished, and how much I've gotten people to like me, it's much more subtle, but it's just as prevalent. Because you see, we live out of what we are aware of. We don't live out of what we know. We live out of what we are aware of. And most of us live during the week out of an underlying awareness of shame and our failed attempts at covering up with our self-created fig leaf. But then we go to church Sunday, and typically we leave more ashamed than before we went. The sermon typically points out one more thing I'm supposed to do, added to all the other stuff that I'm not doing. I'm not doing what he said last week. How am I going to get caught up for this week? And listen, preachers pull their hair out over this because they tend to think that preaching is so powerful, their preaching is so anointed and so wonderful that all you have to do is hear their message and you're going to become this awesome Christian. They don't understand we live our week in shame, aware of our failures, aware of our inability to keep compensating and keep covering up, aware that we're not coming in here as a clean slate today. We're coming in here with this tremendous weight, this underlying sense of shame, this underlying sense of worthlessness, this underlying sense that I'm not valuable, this spiritual tar I'm coming in here with this shame. And we go on Sunday morning and it gives us something else to do to the list of stuff we're already not doing. Boy, don't we look forward to that? You should think, you would hope that we would be mature enough that even as we come in hearing all of this, that the time of worship and the time of praise would be used to take our eyes off our self-awareness and know to put Christ on. But we're so captured by shame, we don't even know how to do that. You see, manipulation becomes the driving force behind trying to get change. Shame plays well from the pulpit. It is good at changing behavior. It is worthless at changing hearts. You see, you can't manipulate me if I don't have shame. Me having shame is absolutely essential for you to be able to manipulate me. You can't manipulate a person who has no shame. If I can just work shame in somehow and get you to feel just bad enough about yourself, I can get you to do what I want you to do, then we are successful. But it does nothing to deal with the source, the shame that we bear. Listen, God never uses shame to control us. I want to say that again. God never uses shame to control us. There's something about it that says, if I can get you feeling bad enough about yourself because of what you're not doing, I can get you to do it. Or if I can get you to feel bad enough about yourself for what you're doing, I can get you to stop doing what you're doing. And manipulation reinforces the shame in our life. Day in and day out, we struggle with that. We face that, the inadequacies, the failures, and all that stuff that we feel so desperately to cover up fig leaves that just rot. Most of the leaves we create don't even get us through the day. I may feel good for a while, but tomorrow is up to vote. And what happens is we become more familiar with the voice of shame than we do the voice of the Spirit. If I am accustomed to being manipulated, if I am accustomed to having shame be the motivation in my life, then the voice of God, who doesn't use shame, who doesn't use manipulation, it's going to be very difficult for me to recognize that. There's no shame with that voice. It must not be God. There's no manipulation with that. That must not be God. What's going on here? Without shame controlling us, what's going to constrain us? What happens is we just become more familiar with the voice of shame than the voice of the Spirit. We think that's going to keep us from sinning. The concept that the awareness of God's love is His provision for us to live victoriously is foreign to our experience. 2 Corinthians 5:14 says, we are controlled by the love of God. That's what constrains us. That's what motivates us, is being aware of God's love for us and never wanting to do anything to violate the presence of God. Now, there are 2 or 3 ways that we manifest sin in our life. And I want to just touch on those briefly. One of the first things is shame drives me from the presence of God. What did Adam do when he sinned? He hid. He didn't want to be around God. You get the impression that he had been familiar with walking and talking with God and knew Him well, but on this day, he didn't want anything to do with the presence of God. Shame had set in. He was not aware of God's love. His perception of God became distorted, as seen through the eyes of shame. Shame perceived God to be someone who was not a welcoming influence. He didn't want to be in His presence. didn't want to hear what he had to say. It goes something like this. He doesn't want to hear from you. He's mad at you. He doesn't want you around. You've already worn out your welcome. How many times do you think you can blow it and still come back and get forgiveness? God's done all he can do. Until you keep your promise and keep your commitment, don't you dare think you can come to God. You must get your life cleaned up before you can come to God. All of that is driven, and much more is driven by shame. We want to avoid. We want to hide from anything that has to do with God, whether it's his presence or his people, because after all, they have it all together. Or, well, at least they pretend to have it all together. Why do I want to be around a bunch of people who always have it together? Why do you want to be around people who pretend to have it together? Like me, I am pretending, I'm trying, I'm doing the best I can. Every time the edges begin to wilt on the leaf, I look for another one. I want nothing to do with his presence, nothing to do with his people, nothing to do with his word, nothing to do with his spirit, nothing to do with praise, worship, thanksgiving, or fellowship, because the shame rises up inside of me. Now, we never say, I'm going to hide from God. We just conveniently get so busy that we can't have time to be around him. Too busy preparing and maintaining our fig leaf that we just don't have the chance to be around him. That's shame. That posture is motivated by shame. Who wants to be around God? Who wants to be around his people? So when we use that excuse, I've been just too busy, the heart of the issue is that shame has driven you from his presence. You've given ground to it. Here's the second one. Shame may indeed drive us to religious activity, because all of that is part of creating a fig leaf. We can keep up the appearance. We can keep up the activity, the religious activity, but the awareness of his presence is gone. We will keep up whatever vocabulary or religious activity is acceptable to the group that we want to fit in with, or be accepted by or looked up to. But real fellowship with the Father and with his people is gone. We maintain the rituals, but the life is gone. We keep up the emotions to try and satisfy the demands we keep up the motions to try and satisfy the demands of shame that's driving us. There's no real enjoyment of the Lord. There's no intimacy, but a life of religious activity. I think, what can I do to make up for what I've done? If I do this, then he'll love me. If I go to church, then I know he'll love me. What board can I serve on? What mission outreach can I participate in? Where else can I serve? What class can I teach? If the truth were known, it's all done in an effort to compensate for the shame and just feel better about myself. And what happens is, in our daily life, discontent overrides thanksgiving. Criticism trumps praise. Ceremony replaces worship. Isolation is preferred to fellowship. Ritual substitutes for relationship. It tends to drive us to religious activity. Third thing is, we tend to avoid the very things God has placed in our lives to experience victory over shame. We tend to avoid the very things God has placed in our lives to experience victory over shame. Where else was Adam going to go to get wholeness but from God? Where else was Adam going to get forgiveness but from God? Where else was Adam going to get fellowship and intimacy and affirmation and acceptance and love? Where else but from God? The very one he tried to avoid. There was no more enjoyment of the Lord. After all, how can I enjoy being around someone who's constantly holds my failures over my head and holds my inadequacies out before me and keeps reminding me of them? Here's the awesome thing about it. In the depth of our shame, God is still calling out our name, not to punish us, not to condemn us, not to scold us, but to cover us with the only provision that exists to remedy shame. There is one provision and one alone. There is no other. He is pursuing us. He hasn't written us off. You see, for shame to have a hold, we have to see God through the eyes of shame. And when we see God through shame, our assessment of him becomes, he wants to write us off. He wants to reject us. We cannot see that he's pursuing us, not to punish us, not to condemn us, not to scold us, but to cover us with the only thing that is available to cover shame. And then the fourth one, which is really the obvious one, we tend to embrace harmful, addictive behavior to numb us to the shame. God didn't ask Adam where he was for his benefit. He didn't ask Adam, where are you? Because he didn't know. He knew. He knew where Adam was. He asked for Adam's benefit. He knew when he said, have you eaten, that he had eaten. He knew death had already come on him. He knew. No fig leaf, no amount of addiction, no amount of alcohol, no amount of drugs can numb us to the effects of shame. It always takes more. But we continue to pursue that into the state of addiction, thinking this will take care of, this will numb me to the shame. This will be the answer to the shame that I feel. The truth of the matter is, only the Father had the answer to the shame. Adam knew he had eaten. God knew he had eaten. So why would he ask that question? Because God wanted Adam to know that God already knew and was still pursuing him. He wants you to know that he already knows. Listen, confession is not bringing God up to speed. God, you notice I sin. Confession is not filling in the blanks for God. Confession is agreeing with what God says already. He knew Adam was naked. He knew Adam had eaten. All he wanted Adam to do was say, I ate, I am naked, without qualification. Adam tried to stick a qualification on it. The other woman you gave me, she's the problem. Then Eve put a qualification. Yeah, the serpent, what God wanted Adam to say is, I ate, I am naked. God knew, and he wanted Adam to know that he already knew. And he was not angry with him. He was not judging him. You know what he did when he found him? He extended mercy and grace. Mercy was he didn't get what he deserved. Grace means he got what he didn't deserve. God didn't kill him. That's mercy. He clothed him. That's grace. And what did the psalmist say? Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life. Why? Because you're such a good person? Because you have it so together? Because you have all of your ducks in a row? Because you're so successful? No. Because you're such a good person? No. Because he knows you're going to mess up so much. Because he knows I'm going to mess up. But what is extended from God when we mess up? Grace and mercy. Shame says, you got to do better than this. God says, where are you? Did you eat? I know where you are. I know that you ate. What's your take on it? Would you agree with me without qualification? I have something for you. It's mercy. I have something for you. It's grace. It's been following you all the days of your life. All of the steps in your life, all of the activities, mercy and grace are following you. God's calling your name. Where are you? Where are you? We're so afraid of being exposed, so afraid of being seen as weak, so afraid of being uncovered. God says, I know. I'm just waiting for you to agree with me without qualification. I have something for you. It's mercy and it's grace and it's not judgment. Listen, we think our busyness protects us. We think our activities protect us. If it just drowns out the sound of the shame. If you don't think shame is an issue for you, try being still. See how vulnerable you feel. See how unprotected you feel. An indicator of shame is anything I feel like I have to do in order to feel better about myself. When the Father says, I have the answer to your shame. I have mercy and I have grace, and it is found in the person of my Son. And I want to free you from all of this shame that you're experiencing. We're gonna pause here again for time's sake, and we'll take this up in the next one. I want to encourage you to go before the Father and just ask Him. This is what Psalms 139 was all about. When He said, search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thought, and see if there be any harmful way in me. There is no more harmful way in me than shame. It is destructive to my life, to my relationships, to my fellowship with the Father. And see if it's there. Reveal it to me and lead me in the path that's better. That's your path, your perspective for me. Thank you for listening. If you like what you've heard, if you'll click like, and if you'll subscribe, you'll get a notification anytime there's a new one come out. So Lord bless you.